The spine of the ledger was cool beneath Eleanora Finch's fingers, a line of cracked leather that felt more like a friend than an object. Here, in the quiet of her uncle's study, the world resolved itself into clean columns of ink and the satisfying certainty of a balanced account. Outside this room, the world was a less manageable place. It was a place of hierarchies and careful omissions, a world in which she was the most frequent omission of all. Today, that omission was to be formalized. His Grace, the Duke of Alistair, was expected before evening, and the house had been in a state of managed hysteria for a fortnight. Eleanora? Her aunt's voice, sharp and thin as a dressmaker's pin, cut through the quiet. Lady Ashworth stood in the doorway, her silk morning gown rustling with impatience. "What are you still doing in here? The dust covers in the west drawing room need to be removed, and you must see that Cook has remembered the Duke's preference for claret over port." "Mrs. Gable has seen to the drawing room, Aunt Augusta," Eleanora replied, not looking up from the page. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. "And I spoke with Cook this morning. The claret was brought up from the cellar yesterday to breathe." A small, frustrated sound escaped her aunt. "You are always one step ahead in the household accounts, niece. But it is the social accounts that matter today. The Duke is not coming to inspect our ledgers." The implication was clear. He was coming to inspect the household's primary asset, her cousin, Cecilia. Eleanora made a final notation, the number 7 drawn with a steady hand. She blotted the ink and closed the heavy book. Only then did she turn, her expression calm, her posture still. "Is there something else?" Lady Ashworth's gaze fell to the front of Eleanora's dove-grey dress, a garment chosen specifically for its ability to render the wearer nearly invisible. A thin, silver chain was visible at her throat, from which hung a small, plain locket. "Put that away," her aunt commanded, her voice devoid of its usual social grace. "It is morbid. There is no need to advertise your history. It casts a pall." The locket felt suddenly cold against her skin. It held a miniature of a man she had loved, a man who had been dead for 3 years, a man whose absence was the defining feature of her life, a private grief her family treated as a public inconvenience. She did not argue. She simply tucked the locket beneath the high collar of her dress, the silver a small, secret weight against her heart. "You will take your meals in your room while His Grace is with us," Lady Ashworth continued, turning toward the hall. "It is better this way. Your quietness can be misconstrued as sullenness. Cecilia must be allowed to shine. We cannot afford any distractions." "I understand," Eleanora said to her aunt's retreating back. And she did. She was a distraction. A 24-year-old unmarried relation with no dowry and a history of sorrow was a smudge on the otherwise pristine portrait of a family with a beautiful, eligible daughter. Her role was to be the silent, efficient machinery that kept the house running, so that Cecilia could be its effortless, charming ornament. She remained in the study long after her aunt had gone, the scent of lemon oil and old paper a familiar comfort. She ran a hand over the ledger, its solid reality a bulwark against the rising tide of her own invisibility. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Instead, she felt a quiet, hollow ache. It was the ache of being seen only for what she lacked, never for what she possessed. She possessed a keen mind, a steady hand, and an unshakable integrity. She could make sense of chaos, could find order in a column of figures, could manage the slow, inevitable decline of her uncle's estate with a precision that kept them all afloat. But these were skills of the back rooms, of the quiet studies.
They had no currency in the drawing room, where the only thing of value was a pretty face and a quick, witty reply. Cecilia had both. Eleonora had the ledgers, and so it was decided. She would remain with the ledgers, out of sight, a ghost in her own home, while the living held court. Later, from her upstairs window, she watched the Duke's carriage arrive. It was a formidable vehicle, black, with a crest on the door so discreet it was almost invisible, unless the light caught it just so. The man who emerged was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered, with dark hair. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested immense confidence, or perhaps immense control. He did not smile as her uncle and a beaming Cecilia greeted him on the steps. His face was a mask of polite neutrality. Eleonora watched until they had all disappeared inside. Then she turned from the window and picked up a book. It was a treatise on agricultural rotation. It would be, she suspected, far more interesting than the conversation at dinner. The Duke of Allister was a man who operated from a position of profound disappointment. His first marriage had been a catastrophe of glittering surfaces and ruinous depths. He had married a celebrated beauty only to discover she was a creature of appetites, for admiration, for jewels, for other men, that no single person could ever hope to satisfy. Her death, in a carriage accident while returning from a clandestine rendezvous, had been a public scandal and a private, complicated relief. The experience had cauterized something within him. He now viewed the polished charm of society women with the suspicion of a seasoned investor examining counterfeit currency. He had come to Ashworth Manor seeking the opposite, a wife of sensible disposition, good breeding, and, preferably, a quiet nature. Miss Cecilia Ashworth was famed for her beauty, which was a mark against her in his private ledger, but she was also said to be of a gentle and biddable temperament. He was here to determine if the latter quality was sufficient to overcome the former. He found the Ashworths to be precisely as advertised. Lord Ashworth was a genial but fading gentleman, his conversations circling back to the same anecdotes. Lady Ashworth was a monument to social anxiety, her every word and gesture calibrated for maximum effect. And Miss Ashworth was beautiful, undeniably so. She was also animated, witty, and determined to charm. As he sat in the drawing room, a cup of tea cooling beside him, he found his attention drifting. He was listening to Miss Ashworth describe a ball in London, but he was noticing the room itself. The furniture was fine, but a threadbare patch on the Aubusson carpet was cleverly concealed by a small table. The silver tea service was magnificent, but he had noted the worn plating on the sugar tongs. The house, like its inhabitants, presented a flawless facade that did not quite bear close inspection. It was a performance, and he had grown weary of performances. He had been told there was another member of the family, a niece. He had only caught the briefest glimpse of her as he arrived, a fleeting figure in a grey dress disappearing down a corridor. He had assumed she was a companion or a senior servant. It was only when Lord Ashworth had become confused about a name that his wife had corrected him, saying, "No, my dear, that was Eleonora's father. You remember my late sister's child?" A niece. He filed the information away without comment. Later that afternoon, seeking a moment of solitude, he made his way toward the library. The door was slightly ajar, and as he approached, he heard voices from within. It was Lady Ashworth and her daughter. "Absolutely must make more of an effort, Mamma," Cecilia was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "He barely smiled at my story about Lady Danbury's pug. I felt like a dancing bear." "He is a duke, Cecilia, and a reserved one at that. He is not some young officer to be won over with trifles. You must project serenity and good sense."
"And how am I to do that when the estate is in such a state? Papa could not even remember the name of his own tenant this morning. It is mortifying. Thank heavens Eleonora handles all of that," Lady Ashworth sighed.
We do not speak of that, especially not within these walls. Eleanora's usefulness is a private matter. To the world, she is our poor, quiet niece, a melancholic creature who prefers her own company. It is a much more suitable narrative. Alastair froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. He should not be listening. It was dishonorable. But the words held him fast. A melancholic creature who prefers her own company. He remembered the fleeting glimpse of the grey dress. Was that the niece? The one who handled the estate? He took a step back, melting into the shadows of the hallway as the library door opened. Cecilia and her mother emerged, their faces reset into masks of pleasant composure. They did not see him. He waited until their footsteps had faded before he continued down the corridor, the conversation echoing in his mind. He had been presented with a narrative, a suitable narrative, and like the worn carpet and the peeling silver plate, he suspected it was designed to conceal something far more interesting than what was on display. He had come to Ashworth Manor to assess a potential bride, but he now found himself intrigued by the ghost her family was so determined to keep in the closet. The quiet niece. The one who was not at dinner. The one who, apparently, held the place together. For 2 days, Eleanora remained a ghost. She took her meals on a tray in her room, delivered by a young maid whose expression was a mixture of pity and awe. She spent her hours in the study, bringing order to the chaotic mess of her uncle's correspondence, updating the rent rolls, and drafting a letter to the solicitor regarding a boundary dispute. The work was a balm, a quiet assertion of her own reality in a house that seemed determined to deny it. Through Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, she received updates on the ducal visit. "His Grace is a very serious gentleman," Mrs. Gable reported, setting down a cup of tea on the corner of the large desk. The housekeeper was a stout woman with kind eyes and hands that were never still. She was the only person in the house, besides Lord Ashworth, who knew the full extent of Eleanora's work. "Doesn't say much, just watches. Miss Cecilia is fluttering around him like a moth around a candle, but I'm not sure he's even noticing the flame." Eleanora smiled faintly. "Cecilia is used to being noticed." "Aye, well, this one's different." Mrs. Gable lowered her voice. "He asked your uncle about crop rotation yesterday. Your uncle just stammered. The Duke looked unimpressed." She paused, her gaze resting on the neat stacks of papers on Eleanora's desk. "It's you he should be talking to." "That would hardly be proper, Mrs. Gable." "Proper?" the housekeeper sniffed. "Is letting a good mind go to waste while a silly one chatters on about fashion? No, Miss Eleanora, that's not proper. It's a shame." She patted Eleanora's shoulder, a rare gesture of affection that spoke volumes. "Don't you let them make you feel small. You're the biggest person in this house." The words were a small, warm stone in the cold pond of her isolation. She held on to them long after Mrs. Gable had left. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Silas Croft. He was a tenant farmer, his face weathered and ruddy with anger, his boots leaving clumps of mud on the polished floor of the entrance hall. He was shouting, demanding to see Lord Ashworth, something about a water right and a new fence his neighbour had erected. The footman was attempting to placate him, but Croft was a man pushed past the point of deference. The commotion drew everyone. Lord Ashworth emerged from the drawing room, looking bewildered. Lady Ashworth followed, her face a mask of horror at this breach of decorum. Cecilia hovered in the doorway, aghast. And behind them, silent and watchful, was the Duke of Alastair. "Croft, what is the meaning of this?" Lord Ashworth demanded, trying to summon an authority his trembling hands betrayed. "The meaning, my lord," Croft boomed, twisting a mud-caked hat in his hands, "is that the Hendersons have fenced off the stream. My cattle can't get to water. You promised me that right of way when I signed the new lease. It's all there in the papers." "The stream?" Lord Ashworth looked utterly lost. I don't recall." "You don't recall?" Croft's voice rose with incredulity. "It was the only reason I agreed to your new rents. You're ruining me, my lord." Alistair stepped forward slightly, his presence calming the room by a fraction. His voice was low and steady. "Perhaps we should look at the lease agreement, Lord Ashworth, and the estate maps." This sent Lord Ashworth into a new fluster. He gestured vaguely toward his study. "Yes, of course, the papers. They are in my study. Somewhere." He looked helplessly at his wife, who looked helplessly at the ceiling. It was a moment of pure, undiluted incompetence, performed on a stage for the most important guest they had ever hosted. The silence stretched, thick with embarrassment. And into that silence, Lord Ashworth finally spoke the only name that could save him. "Eleonora," he said, his voice a reedy plea. "Fetch Eleonora." Lady Ashworth shot him a look of pure fury, but it was too late. A footman was dispatched. A few minutes later, Eleonora appeared. She had been in the gardens, and her cheeks were faintly flushed from the cool air. She wore the same simple grey dress, her hair pinned up in its usual neat coil. She took in the scene at a glance. The furious farmer, her panicked uncle, her mortified aunt, and the tall, unreadable Duke, whose presence seemed to take up all the available oxygen in the hall. She gave a small, respectful curtsy. "Uncle, you sent for me?" "The Croft lease, Eleonora," he mumbled, gesturing toward the farmer. "The water rights. He says—" Eleonora's gaze shifted to Silas Croft. She addressed him directly, her voice calm and clear. "Mr. Croft, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The right-of-way is guaranteed. It is in the addendum to your lease, signed by my uncle 6 months ago. The Hendersons were only granted permission for a fence, not for obstructing access. The boundary marker is 20 feet north of the streambed." Croft stared at her, his anger momentarily short-circuited by her precision. "The addendum? His lordship said nothing of an addendum." "I have the copy in the study, along with the surveyor's map," Eleonora said. "If you will come with me, I can show you." She looked at her uncle. "With your permission, sir?" Lord Ashworth could only nod, a wave of relief washing over his face. Eleonora turned and walked toward the study. Mr. Croft, after a moment's hesitation, followed her. The family and their guest were left in the hall, in the resounding silence of a crisis averted by an expert they had not known was on call. Alistair had watched the entire exchange without moving. He had seen a problem of land management, a topic he understood intimately. He had seen a peer of the realm fail utterly in his duty. And then he had seen a young woman in a grey dress step into the breach and resolve the matter with more quiet authority and factual command than he had witnessed in months of parliamentary debate. She had not been flustered. She had not been arrogant. She had simply been competent. She had spoken to the tenant with respect, citing specific documents and facts. She had solved the problem. He looked at Lady Ashworth, who was trying to pretend this was all perfectly normal. He looked at Cecilia, whose pretty face was clouded with a mixture of relief and resentment. And he thought of the words he had overheard. A melancholic creature. Prefers her own company. It was not a lie, perhaps, but it was a profound misrepresentation. They were not hiding her because she was melancholic. They were hiding her because she was formidable. Her competence was a silent rebuke to her uncle's inadequacy and her cousin's decorative uselessness. She was the engine of the house, kept hidden in the basement while the family showed off the freshly painted facade. A few minutes later, Eleonora emerged from the study with Mr. Croft. The farmer's face was transformed. The anger was gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. He was nodding as Eleonora spoke quietly to him. "And I will send word to Mr. Henderson this afternoon to have the fence moved by tomorrow morning," she was saying. "My apologies for the misunderstanding, Mr. Croft." "No, miss," the farmer said, actually bowing his head slightly. "Thank you, miss. You've set it right." He turned, gave a stiff nod to the assembled gentry, and let himself out. Eleonora turned back to her family. "It is resolved," she said simply, as if reporting that the tea was ready. She met the Duke's eyes for a fraction of a second. There was no triumph in her expression, no plea for acknowledgement. There was only a quiet dignity. Before anyone could speak, she gave another small curtsy and disappeared back down the corridor from which she had come. Alistair felt a fundamental shift in his own internal landscape. He had come here looking for a duchess. He had been examining the merchandise on display. But the real treasure, he suspected, was the one they kept under lock and key. And he suddenly had a great many questions, the most pressing of which was why a woman of such obvious capability was being treated like a shameful secret. That evening, the dinner table was set for 4. The crystal gleamed. The conversation was stilted. Cecilia, dressed in a gown of sapphire silk, was trying to engage the Duke on the topic of art, a subject on which she had been carefully coached. He responded with polite monosyllables, his gaze distant. His mind was elsewhere. It was on the empty space at the table, a space that felt more present than any of the people occupying it. He saw the efficiency of the service, the quality of the food, the perfect arrangement of flowers at the center of the table, and he suspected he knew whose hand had guided it all. He waited for a lull in the conversation, a moment when Cecilia had exhausted her knowledge of Italian painters and her father was nodding off over his soup. He turned to his hostess, his expression unreadable. "Lady Ashworth," he began, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of his rank. The entire table fell silent. "A question, if I may." "Of course, Your Grace," she said, a brittle smile fixed on her face. He paused for a beat, letting the silence build. He looked from her to the empty expanse of damask tablecloth. "Your niece, Miss Finch," he said, the name dropping into the room like a stone into a still pond. "Why is she not at dinner?" The question was a direct hit. It was not an accusation, but it was an inquiry so pointed, so contrary to the unspoken agreement of her invisibility, that it struck Lady Ashworth like a physical blow. A flush crept up her neck. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Eleonora?" she finally managed, feigning surprise. "Oh, she has a headache, Your Grace. She so often does. A delicate constitution." Alistair held her gaze. He did not smile. He did not challenge the lie directly. He simply let it hang in the air, exposed and flimsy. "I see," he said softly. "A pity. I was hoping to discuss the matter of agricultural leases with her. I found her insights this afternoon to be most illuminating." Cecilia's fork clattered against her plate. Lord Ashworth, now wide awake, stared at his wineglass as if it held the secrets to the universe. The lie had been named, the pretense shattered. The ghost in the back room, had just been invited to the head of the table, and the living did not know what to do. The rest of the meal passed in a state of excruciating tension. Alistair said little more, but his point had been made. He had seen what they were hiding, and now he was looking for it. The next morning, he found her. He had bypassed the drawing room with its promise of stilted conversation with Cecilia and made his way to the one room in the house that now held any interest for him, the library. She was there, standing on a rolling ladder, her back to the door. She was carefully placing a heavy volume onto a high shelf. The grey dress could not conceal the elegant line of her back, nor the focused grace of her movements. For a moment, he simply watched her, this hidden, competent woman. He cleared his throat. "Miss Finch?" She startled, her hand flying to the shelf to steady herself. She looked down, and he saw a flicker of alarm in her eyes before it was replaced by a mask of calm neutrality. "Your Grace?" she said, her voice low. She made no move to descend. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are not. I am merely reorganizing my uncle's collection. He has a habit of leaving books wherever he finishes them." There was no complaint in her tone, merely a statement of fact. "A common affliction," Alistair said, moving further into the room. He gestured to the volume in her hand. "What is the subject?" "Roman aqueducts," she replied. "My uncle has a surprising interest in ancient engineering." "As do I," he said, and it was true. His own library at Blackwood Manor was renowned for its collection of architectural and engineering texts. "The Pont du Gard is a particular marvel." He saw a flicker of genuine interest in her eyes. "You have seen it?" "I have. The sheer scale, the precision of the stonework. It is a monument to function as much as to form." "Function is its own form of beauty," she said, almost to herself. Then, as if realizing she had spoken too freely, she looked away. "I should let you have the library to yourself, Your Grace." "On the contrary," he said quickly, "I came here hoping to find you." He saw her stiffen slightly, and he softened his tone. "I meant what I said last night. I was impressed by your handling of the situation with Mr. Croft. You have a remarkable grasp of your uncle's estate affairs." She finally began to descend the ladder. When she reached the floor, she stood before him, not quite meeting his eye. "My uncle has not been in the best of health. I assist him where I can." It was a modest, self-effacing statement that told him nothing and everything. She was loyal, discreet, and she did not seek credit. "Your assistance," Alistair said, his voice deliberate, "appears to be the foundation upon which this entire estate rests." This time, she did meet his eye, and for the first time, he saw past the quiet facade. He saw a flash of profound weariness, of a strength that had been tested for years and had never been allowed to show fatigue. It was there and gone in an instant. "My family has been very good to me, Your Grace," she said, the formal words a shield. He knew then that he would get no further by direct questioning. She was too guarded, too conditioned to hide. He would have to find another way. He changed the subject, speaking of books, of history, of the challenges of managing land that had been in a family for centuries. He asked her questions, not as a duke to a poor relation, but as one intelligent person to another. And slowly, cautiously, she began to answer. He saw the sharp, analytical mind at work behind the quiet grey eyes. He learned that her father had been a scholar with a passion for architecture, that he had taught her to read plans and appreciate the structural integrity of a building.
Cecilia found them there an hour later, deep in conversation over a folio of Palladian villa designs. Her smile was brittle as glass.
"Oh, there you are, Your Grace. We were wondering where you had gone. Eleonora, darling, shouldn't you be seeing to the luncheon menus?
The spell was broken. Eleonora immediately withdrew into herself, the light in her eyes extinguished.
Of course, Cecilia, Your Grace,
she murmured, giving a small curtsy and slipping from the room. Alistair watched her go, a cold anger settling in his chest. He turned to Cecilia, his expression unreadable.
Miss Finch and I were having a fascinating discussion, Miss Ashworth. She has a mind of considerable substance.
Cecilia's laugh was a nervous tinkle.
Oh, Eleonora is very serious. She has always preferred books to people. A consequence of her sad history, I suppose.
He knew a dismissal when he heard one, but it was too late. He was no longer interested in the pretty, polished surfaces Cecilia offered. He was interested in the substance she so casually belittled. The next day, he sent a rider to his own estate. The man returned 2 days later with a carefully wrapped parcel. It was a rare, first-edition copy of Vitruvius's De Architectura. He asked a footman to deliver it to Miss Finch's room with a simple card that read, "For a continuing conversation." The book was an offering. It was a key, extended to a lock he was not yet sure would turn. Eleonora received it in the privacy of her room, her fingers tracing the tooled leather binding. It was more than a gift. It was a recognition. It was a signal, sent from the drawing room to the back room, that someone had finally bothered to look past the door. She opened the cover and saw the Duke's bookplate, his coat of arms stark and clear. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a crack in the careful wall she had built around her heart. It was a terrifying feeling. It felt, alarmingly, like hope. Her aunt and cousin, of course, noticed the shift. The Duke no longer sought out Cecilia's company after dinner. Instead, he would retreat to the library, leaving the door pointedly ajar. After a polite interval, Eleonora would be sent for, on the pretext of locating a book or clarifying some point from her uncle's papers. The pretexts grew thinner with each passing day. The conversations grew longer. They spoke of crop yields and drainage tiles, of Tudor brickwork and Gothic arches. He discovered the dry wit that lay dormant beneath her reserve. She discovered the keen sense of duty that drove the powerful, solitary man. Cecilia's resentment began to curdle into something sharper. One afternoon, as the Duke was preparing to ride out to inspect a tenant farm, she approached him in the hall, Eleonora standing nearby with a map he had requested.
Your Grace seems to have taken a great interest in our dreary estate matters,
Cecilia said, her voice laced with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes.
I do hope Eleonora is not boring you. She can be rather single-minded. We try to encourage her to think of more pleasant things, but since her tragedy, she finds comfort only in her ledgers.
It was a cruel, calculated strike, designed to remind him of Eleonora's status as a damaged, sorrowful creature, unfit for lighter society. Eleonora flinched, the colour draining from her face. Alistair turned his full attention to Cecilia. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and cold as winter ice. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I find nothing dreary about competence, and I find nothing more unpleasant than the use of a private grief as a public weapon. Miss Finch's mind is a credit to your family. I would have thought you would be proud of it." He did not wait for a reply. He took the map from Eleonora's trembling hand, his fingers brushing hers. "Shall we, Miss Finch?" he asked gently, as if she were the one he had intended to accompany all along. He led her out onto the front steps, leaving Cecilia standing in the hall, her face a mask of stunned humiliation. He had not only defended Eleonora, he had publicly aligned himself with her, and against his hostess's daughter. The battle lines, once invisible, were now drawn. They walked in silence for some time, their path leading toward the gardens at the edge of the formal lawns. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the last of the autumn roses. Eleonora kept her gaze fixed on the gravel path, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her. No one, not even her uncle, had ever done that so publicly. He stopped near a stone bench overlooking a small, ornamental pond. "Please, sit," he said. She did, arranging her grey skirts with a precision that belied her inner turmoil. He remained standing, looking out over the water. The silence between them was no longer the cautious, exploratory silence of their early conversations. It was heavy with unspoken things. Finally, he turned to her. His face was serious, his eyes searching hers. "Miss Finch," he began, his voice low and devoid of all artifice. "When I first arrived at Ashworth Manor, I allowed myself to believe the portrait of you that was painted for me, a quiet, melancholic figure. I accepted it without question. It was an error." He paused, and the weight of his next words filled the space between them. "I did not look closely enough. For that failure of perception, I apologize." The apology was so direct, so specific, it took her breath away. He was not apologizing for her family's cruelty, but for his own complicity in it. He was taking responsibility for his own blindness. It was the most profound gesture of respect she had ever received. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she let him see past the guard she kept. She let him see the years of being overlooked, of being diminished, of her quiet grief being used as a tool to keep her in her place. It was all there in her eyes, a silent, eloquent testimony. "There was nothing for you to see, Your Grace," she whispered, the words barely audible. "They have made sure of that for a very long time." "They were wrong," he stated, the words a simple, solid fact. "I see you now, Eleonora." He had used her given name. The sound of it, spoken in his deep voice, was both a shock and a homecoming. A tear she had not known was forming escaped and traced a single, slow path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. For once, she did not hide. She simply sat there, in the cool autumn air, and allowed herself to be seen. It was the beginning of everything. The Duke extended his stay by another week, and then another. The household settled into a new, tense equilibrium. Lady Ashworth and Cecilia were models of strained civility, their resentment a palpable force in every room. But their power had been neutralized. The Duke's preference was now unmistakable. He spent his mornings riding the estate with Eleonora, his afternoons in the library with her, and in the evenings he insisted she join them for dinner, where he directed most of his conversation to her. He was not courting her in any conventional sense. He was consulting her. He was learning from her. He was, in his own deliberate way, making her indispensable, not just to the estate, but to him. The breaking point came not with a social confrontation, but with a quiet, medical one. Lord Ashworth, who had been growing increasingly frail, suffered a mild seizure during his afternoon nap. The house was thrown into chaos. The doctor was sent for, and Lady Ashworth collapsed into hysterics. Cecilia, for all her social poise, was useless in a genuine crisis, wringing her hands and weeping in a corner of the drawing room. It was Eleonora who took command. She dispatched a groom for the doctor. She directed Mrs. Gable and the footman in carrying her uncle to his bed. She sat by his side, her calm presence a steadying influence, until the doctor arrived. She was the one who listened to the doctor's instructions, who understood his concerns about a second, more serious event, who asked intelligent questions about medication and care. Alistair stood back and watched it all unfold. He saw her, not as a manager of accounts, but as a leader. When the immediate crisis had passed and Lord Ashworth was sleeping peacefully, the doctor drew Alistair and Eleanora aside in the hall. "His lordship's mind is failing," the doctor said grimly. "This episode is a warning. He must be protected from all stress. The management of his affairs, his estate, it is beyond him now. Completely." Lady Ashworth and Cecilia joined them then, their faces tear-streaked. "What did he say?" Lady Ashworth demanded. "Will he be well?" Eleanora answered before the doctor could. Her voice was gentle but firm. "The doctor says Uncle Thomas must have complete rest. He is not to be troubled with any business." "But the estate," Cecilia cried. "Who will manage everything?" The question was laced with panic. The foundation of their comfortable world had just crumbled. All eyes turned to Eleanora. In that moment, her role shifted irrevocably. She was no longer the hidden helper. She was the sole pillar left standing. Alistair stepped forward, placing himself metaphorically and literally at her side. He addressed the doctor, but his words were for the family. "I will remain for as long as I am needed. Miss Finch has the situation well in hand, but I will be here to offer any support she requires." It was a public declaration. He was not taking over. He was reinforcing her authority. He was making it clear to everyone that from this point forward, Eleanora Finch was the head of this house. Lady Ashworth stared at him, then at her niece, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. She had spent years hiding Eleanora in the back rooms, only to have the most powerful man she had ever met place her on a throne. In the days that followed, Eleanora ran Ashworth Manor. She did so with the same quiet efficiency she had always possessed, but now it was visible. She met with the steward, she dictated letters to the solicitor, she approved household expenditures. Alistair was her silent partner. He would sit in the study while she worked, offering a quiet word of advice when asked, providing a formidable, ducal presence that quelled any potential challenges to her authority. One evening, after a long day, they sat alone in the library, a companionable silence between them. The fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow on the book-lined walls. "You are tired," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "The work is familiar," she replied. "It is the visibility that is new." He turned in his chair to face her more fully. "It is a visibility that suits you." He paused, his gaze direct and serious. "Eleanora, this situation is not sustainable. Your uncle will not recover his faculties. Your aunt and cousin are incapable of managing their own lives, let alone an estate. You cannot remain here, propping them up forever." She knew he was right. The thought of her own future was a door she had kept firmly closed for years. There was nothing behind it but a grey, empty room. "I have no other prospects, Your Grace," she said, the simple truth laid bare. "You are wrong," he said. He rose from his chair and came to stand before her. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a palpable force. "I have spent the last weeks observing a woman of immense intelligence, integrity, and strength. I have come to value her mind and to admire her character above all others." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "My first marriage was a disaster, built on surfaces.
I have no interest in repeating that mistake. I am a man with a great many duties, a large estate, and a life that requires a partner, not a decoration.
Your mind and my duties are aligned. Your character is the foundation upon which I wish to build my future. He took a breath. I am not a poet, Eleonora. I cannot offer you pretty words. But I can offer you my respect, which is absolute, my trust, which is total, and my name, if you will do me the honor of accepting it. I believe we would be a formidable partnership. It was the most honest, unromantic, and deeply moving proposal a woman had ever received. He was not offering her passion or undying devotion. He was offering her something far more valuable, something she had been denied her entire life: recognition. He was offering her a partnership of equals. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow.
Alistair,
she said, his name a quiet revelation on her tongue. And then, with all the steady certainty with which she balanced a ledger, she gave him her answer.
Yes,
she said.
yes, Your Grace.
3 months later, the Duchess of Alistair stood in the great library of Blackwood Manor. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with soaring arched windows that looked out over 1,000 acres of rolling parkland. The air smelled of beeswax and old leather, and the faint, clean scent of the sea, which was just a few miles distant. Her husband came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "It is a rather overwhelming collection," he said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "I have been meaning to have it properly catalogued for years." Eleonora smiled.
"I imagine I might be able to assist with that."
He turned to her, his expression softening. He had changed in the months of their marriage. The harsh lines around his eyes had eased. He smiled more often, a slow, quiet curving of his lips that was reserved for her alone. He had found in her not just a competent duchess who managed his vast households with an effortless grace that stunned his staff, but a companion who understood the burdens of his position and the workings of his mind. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out a small, ornate iron key. "I had this made for you," he said. He pressed it into her palm. "It is for my private study, the estate office. No one but I has ever had a key to that room." She looked down at the key, its weight solid and real in her hand. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was not a trinket. It was a symbol of ultimate trust. It was the key to the very heart of his world, the center of all his duties and responsibilities. He was not just giving her access, he was giving her a share of the burden, and in doing so, a share of himself. She curled her fingers around it, the metal cool against her skin. She looked up at her husband, the Duke of Alistair, the man who had looked into the back room and seen not a shadow, but a queen. The melancholy of her past had not vanished. It was part of the tapestry of her life, a thread of silver woven into the grey. But it was no longer the whole cloth. Here, in this vast, quiet library, held in the steady gaze of a man who saw her completely, she felt a sense of peace so profound it was like coming home.
"Thank you,"
she said softly. He did not reply in words. He simply lifted her hand, the one holding the key, and raised it to his lips. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, of fealty, of a love that had been earned not through grand declarations, but through the quiet, daily practice of being seen. The world outside could clamor and scheme, but here, in the heart of their shared life, there was only a quiet, unshakable partnership. And for Eleonora, who had spent so long being nothing, it was everything.